Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Still. Thank you very much for accepting our request, and I'm very grateful to you for it. I know as you don't need any introduction for our viewers and readers, but just a short introduction. You entered in politics you served as the leader of Liberals for 12 years, from 1976 to 1988. And then you were a member of Scottish Parliament for only 4 years, well, from 1999, and then you're sitting in House of Lords from 1997, and when you became the leader of the Liberals, you were the youngest leader in British politics. So
at the time,
but so now I think,
yeah.
Yes. And so my first question is, what was your finest hour as a leader of the Liberal Party?
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer that immediately,
Yes.
because I was expecting you to say what was your finest hour full stop.
Yes.
And the answer to that question
Yes.
is quite definite. It was on the 27th of March,
Yes.
1965, when I was elected at a by-election
Yes.
to Parliament. Because without that, nothing else would have happened.
Yes.
And that's why that is the most significant day.
Yes, absolutely.
As you say, I was 12 years leading the Liberal Party, which is the longest that anyone has led the Liberal Party, except for Mr. Asquith, who was, of course,
Yes.
Prime Minister.
Yes.
High points, well, there were lots of them, but one obviously was the agreement with Prime Minister Callaghan to stabilise a parliamentary majority for the government. It was called the Lublav Pact. It wasn't a coalition, but it was an agreement to consult on policies for 18 months.
In 1977.
1977 to 78. And it was successful in the sense that it brought down the rate of inflation from 22% to 8%, still very high,
Yes.
but the country was in a real financial difficulty. So by keeping outside the government, but having consultation with them as to what they were doing, I think we were able to give the Liberal Party a positive role.
And one of your most legislative achievements was legalization of abortion. So what are your regards?
Well, that was
in 1967.
Earlier, of course, that was 1967,
Yes.
and again. That came about because I drew number 3 in the ballot for private members' bills. As a student of politics, you should realise that there's a very important word in politics which nobody talks about in the classroom. It's called luck.
Yes.
And one part of the luck was winning the raffle.
Yeah.
We call it a ballot. It's a much better word,
Yes.
but it's a raffle
Yes.
every year to draw places in the ballot for private members' bills. So I was number 3. And that enabled me to introduce something constructive. I was actually the 7th member who tried to get the law on abortion changed from 1953 right through to 1967. And the others had all failed, not through lack of support, but through lack of time. So that number 3 place in the ballot was crucial. I had time, which they didn't have. And it took all that time, it took 18 months to get the legislation through. Very strongly supported across party with the organisation of the Abortion Law Reform Association outside Parliament, largely a medical organisation, campaigning to have the law changed.
You said in your previous interviews, you said after nearly 50 years you still get letters on this very issue.
I do. I get congratulatory letters. Yes. And I get hate letters, both.
Yes.
It's extraordinary because it's not an issue that will ever die down. I mean, some people say this is wonderful. Last year they made me an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So they were saying, the medical profession was saying, thank you very much, this has made a big difference to our lives. So that happens on the one hand, and on the other hand there are people who say that this is wrong and we want to oppose the Abortion Act. But because I keep pointing out that if they do that, if ever it were repealed, we get back to the days when there was still a lot of abortion, but it was illegal and dangerous.
But do you think there should be a new debate on this very issue? the House of Commons and also House of
Well, I think there probably will be, because the law is now 40 years old.
Yes.
At the time, the only method of terminating a pregnancy was by surgery. That's not the case now. You do it by a pill, so that the law is, in some senses, out of date. And it's interesting that our neighbouring countries in Europe, who at the time regarded us as going ahead on this issue, are, if you like, more liberal than we are, because they allow abortion on demand in the first 13 weeks of pregnancy, most of them. That doesn't happen here. You still have to have a certificate signed by 2 doctors.
And then when you became the leader of the Liberal Party, your strategy was to achieve a political realignment. So to what extent did you achieve it?
Well, undoubtedly that the alignment with the Social Democratic Party, when it was formed, was crucial. And in the 1983 election, well, not only did we win lots of by-elections, but in the 1983 election, we got within 2% of the same vote that the Labour Party had. But they were the official opposition, 200 odd seats, and we had 20. So it was a very unfair system. But it was a massive popular support for realigning politics. And it would have been even more successful if it hadn't been for the Falklands War.
Yes.
Because up until that point, in 1981, we were winning everything in sight. And at one opinion poll, we were up to 50%.
Yes.
So the Falklands War changed British politics completely.
And then you, in one of your party conferences, you told them that they should go back to their constituencies and prepare themselves. And were you disappointed when your party?
Yes, of course I was disappointed, because, as I say, the Falklands War wiped domestic politics off the agenda.
Yes.
And Margaret Thatcher, who had been really quite unpopular as Prime Minister, suddenly became a combination of Britannia and Boadicea, and she was a great heroine. So it changed the whole political situation in 1983. And although we had this massive support of nearly a quarter of the population, quarter of the electorate, it didn't reflect itself in the House of Commons. So it was a disappointment, yes.
Yes. And in 1983, before the election, there was a meeting with your members of your party, which you planned to depose Roy Jenkins as a leader of Alliance.
No, that's not quite right. What happened was that we were running the campaign together as the leader of the 2 parties. Unfortunately, somebody in the SDP devised this title, Prime Minister Designate, which was something we'd never agreed. And it was a rather pompous title, which was attached to him, Prime Minister Designate, and it was silly because there was no need for it. We were quite happy working together. I would have been very content had we won an election for him to be Prime Minister. He had all the age and experience that I didn't have. So that was not an issue. But because he was described as Prime Minister Designate, the media tended to focus on him rather than on the Liberals. And he had the difficulty that he was fighting to hold on to his constituency. So he wasn't making many tours in the country, whereas I was touring the country, getting big audiences,
Yes.
which was not being shown on television because they were following him in little forays round about Glasgow. And,
Yes.
and it was that was causing the unsettlement. It wasn't in any sense an attempt to depose Roy Jenkins.
And you're saying it was bad news for your party when David Owen replaced Roy Jenkins as a
Well, David
leader.
was more difficult to deal with because we were the same age.
Yes.
And I mean, it's a strange thing to say, but it was easier with Roy Jenkins because he was much older, much more experienced than I was. David and I worked perfectly well together, but it was more difficult, and also he had a slightly different view from the other 3 of the Gang of 4 about relationships with the Liberals. He was not in favour initially of the alliance with the 2 parties. He thought that the SDP should go much more on its own than the other 3 did. So there was a big division between them, not between me and David Owen, but between him and the other 3 in the SDP. And in the end of the day, when I pressed for the alliance to become a united party, he disagreed, and he lost the vote in his own party conference. So that was a sad event, but it stemmed from his consistent view all the way through.
And at that time, your party had a very pro-European stance on Europe. But what happened when Britain entered in European rate mechanism, and then when Black Wednesday happened, and now that Europe wants 2 billion from Britain. So in what ways have you changed your stance on Europe now?
No, I don't think we have. I think we still are seen to be the most pro-European of the three parties. There's no question about that. That doesn't mean to say that we agree with every single thing that Europe does, and this latest demand for sudden sums of money, of course, is crazy. But the problem stems from the fact that right away at the very beginning, and I'm going back to the mid-1950s, Britain did not take part in funding the European community. And the Liberal Party then, which was a very small party that only had half a dozen MPs, divided the House of Commons on that issue in the 50s. And we were alone with, I think, just one or two others who supported it. So we have a consistent view, and every single time, under successive governments, we have missed the bus because we've stayed out too late, all the way through. So our influence in Europe has been much less than it should have been all the way through.
But you say that you haven't, your party hasn't changed its view regarding European Union, but apparently Nick Clegg, the leader of the party, wants, he envisages to have the in-out referendum in 2017 if they go to another coalition with the Conservatives. Do you share his...
Well, he's accepted that if there are major changes to our relations with the European Union, that should be put to the vote. But, I mean, I'm hoping that there won't be major changes. I mean, any change should be for the better, not for the worse. But at the moment, with the way that things are going with David Cameron and his problems with his party, there is a risk that we will get a referendum really rather like the last one, which I was involved in 1975, when Harold Wilson, in order to unite his party, said, oh, well, let's just have a referendum.
Yes.
And I think the same could happen again, in which case the issue will be not the details of the relationship, but the principle of whether we're in or out. And yes, our view has not changed. We should be in.
Just let's go back to your time as a leader of Liberal Party. You always wanted to achieve a political realignment, and then you achieved it. And until 1988, and then when SDP and Liberal Party they got merged, you resigned as a leader of your party. Why you didn't want to be the new leader of Social Democratic Party?
Oh, I had, as I've already said, I've been leader for 12 years,
yes,
which was the longest for anybody except Mr. Asquith. And I just thought that having completed the negotiations, really it made sense for the new party to have a new leader. And at one point, it could have been David Owen, but because he didn't take part in it, he blew that chance.
In what ways Paddy Ashton, the new leader of Social Democratic Party, was different? His approach to some policies were different than yours.
He was, no, his basic alignment was exactly the same as mine. He fought all the way through to try to get a realignment of British politics on the left. I mean, that's disappeared now, but that was his view, and it was a continuation of the view that I inherited from Joe Grimond. His participation as leader was very different from mine. He was much more active in the committees of the party, and the executive and the policy committee and so on, than I was. I had a constituency which was way up in Scotland, yes, which was very big. It needed a lot of attention, and with that, I was unwilling to spend weekends sitting in a party executive committee meeting. So I hardly ever attended those meetings. Paddy took a very different and much more proactive view.
Yes, and then do you regret that you should have taken another stance of the nuclear deterrent in the back to the 1980s, if you had taken a different approach, you could have gained more votes in 1987, more than only 25% of share of votes.
I'm not quite sure that the nuclear issue was that prominent in the minds of the public. But again, we had a consistent view from a way back in Joe Grummond's time as leader, when Britain first got involved in having a so-called independent nuclear deterrent. Not independent at all, because we buy the stuff from America, but it was a pretend British independent nuclear deterrent, Polaris before Trident. And we were opposed to that, because we said it involves nuclear proliferation. We are firm supporters of NATO, we happily to provide the bases and all the rest of it, but to have a separate independent nuclear deterrent was always something that we were opposed to. So that view carried forward into the alliance with the STP, and they didn't necessarily share that view. So there was always a difficulty on that particular subject between us and the STP.
And your party was against the electoral system in this country for a long time, but now this electoral system that your party was against, it's working in favor of your party. Do you agree with it? Because there were polls that suggest that there will be another coalition government after 2015.
Well, there might be. We don't know. I mean, the sad fact is that we are down in the polls compared with where we were before. We're nowhere near the 23 to 24% that we were getting in the 80s. We're now talking of 9–10%. And so what the party is much better at than it was in my time is targeting on constituencies, winning constituencies. I mean, as I said, we had this huge vote in 1983, but we didn't get the seats. The party, the United Party, has become much more professional, much more effective than it was in my time. And in that way, they're able to hang on to seats even if they haven't got the massive vote behind them. And it may well be that there could be another coalition. We don't know, but it'll be more of a rainbow coalition than this one, because you're going to have more nationalists from Scotland, possibly more Greens, possibly some UKIP, plus the Irish and the Welsh. So, you know, it's no longer going to be a two-party parliament or nothing like it.
And some of you members of your Lib Dem party now, they criticize Nick Clegg, and they say that he should have reached a deal with the Labour Party and Gordon Brown instead of David Cameron. Do you agree with that?
It was very difficult because the arithmetic didn't stack up. The natural inclination would have been to do a deal with Gordon Brown. In fact, my only criticism is that they did it in too much of a rush, and they should have begun with Gordon Brown, but they didn't do that. They began with David Cameron. You should always begin with the incumbent Prime Minister, and our inclination would have been to the left. I don't actually think that it would necessarily have made much difference, but it would have strengthened their hand in then dealing with the Conservatives. But because they went to the Conservatives first, and rather pushed Labour to one side, they had a very quick and rough and ready negotiation, which resulted in some mistakes, like the student fees fiasco.
And in your opinion, to which policies Nick Clegg should more focus on to gain more votes?
Well, I think that we should go back to the traditional Liberal policies. For example, industrial co-partnership, employee participation in boards and in shareholdings. I think industrial partnership, pulling people together rather than splitting them apart, is still a very important part of our message. He can also, I think with justification, argue that the coalition government has pulled round the economy. And these are the two things I think they should focus on. What I fear is that the party boffins are busy producing lists and lists of detailed things that we apparently achieved during the coalition, which the public aren't interested in. They're not interested in that. The central message is we, at some cost to ourselves, help to save the country's economy.
And since 1997, you became a peer in House of Lords. So, in what ways House of Lords doing a different job than in the House of Commons?
Well, our role is purely an advisory role. It's a corrective role. We're able to scrutinise legislation, amend legislation, ask the House of Commons to think again, but we cannot veto legislation. The elected House must prevail. But I think that after the referendum in Scotland, there's a new situation where we ought to look at replacing the House of Lords, which is still a mixture of an appointed body and a hereditary body, with a new Senate, smaller and elected by the component parts of the United Kingdom, the House of Commons, the Scottish Parliament, the Northern Ireland Assembly, the Welsh Assembly, members of the European Parliament. Let them, rather as in Germany, where the Bundesrat is elected by the Länder parliaments. So that would not create a rival to the House of Commons, but it would get over the fact that the House of Lords is an unelected body. And it would also help pool, if you like, in a quasi-federal way, the different parts of the United Kingdom together.
And some people see House of Lords as having a lobbying role. Do you agree with them?
In a good sense, yes. Why not? I mean, they have debates on issues which they never have time for in the House of Commons. And I think that's a good thing.
So when you approved the bill in 2012 for reorganization of NHS, do you think that was good policy?
No, I don't think it was, but that's an example of what I'm talking about, where you get involved in the details of legislation. It was basically a conservative legislation, which we tried to improve and possibly did improve in some ways, but it was still very unpopular in the country. And in my view, it was the sort of thing we should just have said, well, we don't want anything to do with this, let it be a conservative issue. We should have concentrated solely on recovering the economy.
And my last question, for the next general election, do you want a Lib Lab coalition or another Lib Dem Conservative coalition?
I would prefer to see a Lib Dem Labour coalition, because I think that's more in keeping with our tradition. But it's for the electorate to decide, not us.
Thank you very much, Lord C, for giving us your time.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much.